All right. Welcome, everybody, to today's Committee for Sydney Global Conversation. I'm Gabriel Metcalf, CEO of the Committee for Sydney, and we're pleased to have with us today the acclaimed economist and author, Ed Glaeser. I'd like to start today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. For me, that is the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to the elders, past, present, and emerging. I also would like to acknowledge our Innovation Fund partners for their core support of the research program of the committee: Campbelltown City Council, Dexis, the ICC, McKinsey, and Western Sydney University. This week marks very significant milestone here in Sydney. We hit 90% of the population over 16 having at least one dose of the vaccination. So from a amazing start to the pandemic to a not so strong middle, we are again doing a good job, and it feels pretty great. It was also, of course, Freedom Day yesterday, at least the start. So I think that's a great time to be having this conversation with Ed Glaeser, here to share thoughts from his most recent book with fellow Harvard economist David Cutler, Survival of the City, Living and Thriving in an Age of Isolation. Ed Glaeser is one of the world's great urbanists and certainly the leading urban economist in the United States. He has written many highly influential articles, as well as a number of books about cities, which have been crossover hits with the general public. For anyone who wants to take on the question, will COVID change cities? This latest book is the place to start that inquiry. It is a wide-ranging history of the relationship between disease, public health, and cities over thousands of years. And it's an exploration of the various forces acting on cities today. The way this will work, he will show slides, give his talk, then we will open it up to Q&A, which you can submit via the app on Zoom, and I'll do my best to get through them. So, Professor Glaeser, thank you for being here today. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for all of you being there. I'm just sorry that I'm not there in Sydney, which I've always thought is one of the world's great cities. And I am certainly delighted to have a conversation about the future of Sydney. If I were giving this talk in, let's say, in those ancient times of 2019, I would start assuredly with a picture like this one. This shows the relationship between population density and GDP per capita productivity across the European Union. Each one of these dots represents 1/10 of the so-called NUTS 3 unions in the EU, about 111 such NUTS 3 unions in each dot. And I've ordered these dots on the basis of their density levels, because at their heart, cities are the absence of physical space between people. Cities are density, proximity, closeness. What the blue line shows is that the densest 10th of Europe's NUTS 3 regions has a GDP per capita that's about double that in the least dense half of the regions in the EU. In the US, you would see a similar relationship, but it would be somewhat less steep. So the densest 10th of America's counties have incomes that are 50% higher than the least dense half of America's counties. This is something economists call agglomeration economies, the fact that we become more productive when we are amidst a maelstrom of economic activity. The top line shows the bumpier relationship between population change between 2000 and 2010 and initial population density. It reminds us that while Americans at the start of the 19th century were leaving their dense enclaves on the eastern seaboard to populate the empty spaces between the oceans, at the start of the 21st century, instead of spreading out, we're clustering in. Along with the rise of cities as places of tremendous productivity in an information age is the rise of housing prices, particularly in city centers. This shows the growth by zip code of housing prices between 1997 and 2015. And as you can see, there was a great tilt that occurred towards city centers. Those points on your left are those ones that are closest to the center city. On the right are those in the more distant suburbs. And this reflects not just the productivity of cities. After all, many of those people who live in the suburbs are commuting into the city to work, but it reflects the rise of cities also as places of pleasure, places where people want to live, what I've called the rise of the consumer city, which has led to places, including Sydney and London and New York and San Francisco, having prices that are way out of whack with their income levels. So this shows the ratio of price to income across different parts of England. And as you can see, that number in Greater London reaches up to 14 times income, whereas in some of the lower density parts of the UK, it's 3 to 4 times income. So it really is a city which is rising, not just because it's rich, but because it is a place where people want to go and find possibility and find enjoyment and find all of these joys that come when we are together and when we can enjoy the entrepreneurship that occurs when people connect in cities. Now, all that is very 2019, because in 2020, this happened. Now, cities and disease are old companions. This image, which is from a follower of the French Baroque artist Nicolas Poussin, is meant to capture one of the ancient plagues. The first well-documented urban plague is the Plague of Athens, which hit that city in 430 BCE. The backstory to the Plague of Athens was, of course, the tremendous flowering of the city in the 5th century, when Athens was doing all that you could possibly ask a great city to do. It was enabling these chains of creativity that gave us architecture, gave us sculpture, it gave us philosophy, it gave us drama, it gave us democracy itself, it gave us math, it gave us science, right? It created just a flourishing to which, the point of which that 5th century Athens becomes practically synonymous with Western culture. And the very success of the city, military, financial, excited envy from their non-urban, highly militaristic counterpart of Sparta. The result was the Peloponnesian War. Now, the leader of the Athenian democracy, Pericles, had a plan to defeat the Spartans, who we know he couldn't defeat on the land. He summoned the Athenians and their allies behind the walls of the city to wait out the conflict, and then sent forth the Athenian navy to harass the coastline of the Peloponnesian Peninsula, where the Spartans lived. The plan was perfectly sound militarily. The wars held up against the Spartan hoplites, but walls that can keep out enemy warriors may not necessarily be able to keep out a bacteria or virus. And it was through the port of Piraeus that the plague entered Athens. Cities are always vulnerable to disease because they are the nodes on the global lattice of travel and trade. It was so in Athens in 430 BCE, and it was so in Sydney and New York in 2020, when returning tourists coming back from Italy brought COVID-19 along with them. Athens in 430, the scene was devastating. The outbreak is well documented because one of the two fathers of history, Thucydides, was there. Perhaps 1/4 of the city's population died over a 2-year period. Thucydides paints a harrowing picture of a city that has gone mad, where people have forgotten all of their mores, all of their norms, because they expected to die tomorrow. Now, Athens would soldier on in the Peloponnesian conflict for another 1/4 century, but in some sense, the glory that the city had been was forever dimmed. Eventually, Athens would go from being, perhaps the New York City of the Mediterranean world to becoming its Boston, perhaps, then becoming its Cambridge, Massachusetts. And it would survive, but it would be a much reduced self. Now, for the next 500 years, pandemic, plague was relatively rare in the world of the Mediterranean. The Roman Empire grew great in a land-based, less trading world, less globalized, and less vulnerable to disease. But in the 2nd century CE, 600 years later, the Antonine Plague hit the Roman Empire. That plague was actually not very devastating because one of the central facts of natural disasters, plague, earthquake, hurricane, is that the impact of the catastrophe is mediated by the strength of the civil society. And so the Antonine Plague, which hit during the 2nd century, hit during a time when the Roman Empire was at its strongest. The 3rd century, the plague of Cyprian, hit when Rome was in far worse trouble, and it helped the unraveling of the empire. Of course, the worst of these events occurred in the 6th century, when the future of the Mediterranean teetered on the edge of a knife. The Western Roman Empire had already fallen, but there was still hope that the Pax Romana could be restored to the Mediterranean world. The first couple of generations of the Ostrogothic kings had died off, and so the decidedly less impressive grandchildren of the original conquerors were left in command of Italy. The great emperor Justinian sent forth his warlord Belisarius to reconquer North Africa, the traditional breadbasket of Rome, and then to conquer Italy. Just at this moment, just as Belisarius's war force is racking up victory after victory, Yersinia Pestis, the Black Death, the bubonic plague itself, shows up in Constantinople. The result is devastating. Year after year, century after century, the plague racks Europe, and may well have been the central force plunging Europe into centuries of medieval darkness, a future that was full of poverty, farming, not cities, militarization, and political chaos. Now, for most of the past 650 years, our cities have proven far more resilient to disease. The Black Death came again in 1350, and it was a demographic catastrophe, just as all these plagues were. But Europe survived it. In the 19th century, another era of globalization, plagues emerged to strike down cities, and the cities got through it. In the early 19th century, yellow fever was the great killer of the cities of America's eastern seaboard. So this is a mosquito-borne illness that emerges out of Africa, gets carried over in sailing ships to the Caribbean and then to the East Coast. And then cholera emerges out of the Ganges Delta in 1817, gets carried along with the British Army throughout India, and then makes its way over land and sea, eventually to London, Paris, and New York. These are devastating events. You can see from the death rates that during bad cholera years, 5% of the city dies. But the cities continue to grow, partially because people were poor, and so the risk of death didn't stop people from urbanizing, but partially also because the cities themselves figured out how to fight illness. They came together, and this is the 3rd chapter of our new book, which tries to make the case that this moment is the point in time in which governments stopped being simply agents of death, which is pretty much all that governments did prior to 1800, and actually became agents of life. And that was something that happened in cities as they invested in aqueducts and sewers and figured out ways to actually reduce these terrible demons that come with density. You can see the Croton Aqueduct was built there in 1842. Interestingly, these forms of infrastructure were built because of a medical mistake. In the early 19th century, there were 2 schools of thought about these diseases, one of which emphasized contagion, which is actually correct, and the contagion theorists called for quarantine. But the other school was the miasma theorists, who thought that the disease emerged out of the ground through bad airs, which is literally what miasma means. Now, the miasma theorists argued for things like aqueducts and sewers and draining the swamp and building things like Central Park in New York, which turned out to be, even though they got the science totally wrong, it turned out to be great public health. And so the disease rates gradually started coming down. It wasn't just about infrastructure. It was also about institutions like the Board of Health. In the book, I tell the story about Dr. Stephen Smith, who was an ordinary doctor who led the charge to create outrage with the low quality of health in the poor parts of the city, and to create this institution, which would then require poor people to connect to the water system, require tenement owners to pay for those connections, or else there would be fines. In some sense, that lesson would have been very helpful for people who work in the developing world today. I work on water in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the things that we routinely find is that some well-meaning aid agency builds a water main outside of a city like Lusaka in Zambia, where I work, and poor people are unwilling to pay the $1,500 or $1,000 connection to the water main because they're poor, and per capita income is at $2,000 in the country. So something that costs 50% of their annual income is a huge deal for them. So you really had to understand that this was the same problem that New York had for 25 years after the Croton Aqueduct opened. And so New York continued to die, just as people continue to die in sub-Saharan Africa today. And it's only when you have things like the Board of Health, which then complement the infrastructure, that you started to get safer cities. Now, you can see over the course of the 19th century, contagious disease ebbs. And for the past century, since the influenza pandemic of 1918, 1919, our cities have been relatively safe. We, in some sense, forgot how deadly they could be. And then all of a sudden, in 2020, it happened again. It happened first in cities, because cities are the ports of entry for goods, for people, for ideas, and for diseases. You can see here, this was of April 30th, 2020, when it was New York City, it was Boston, it was New Orleans, it was Detroit. It was a small number of cities where the disease had come in first, brought in by tourists coming back from Europe, right? And it spread in the dense confines of the city. We see this in the developing world as well. So this shows from Brazil, the share of the population that had the disease as of June 3rd, 2020, and the share of the population living in an informal settlement, a favela. It's very hard to social distance in a favela or in a slum. And so these are the places in which it was impossible to escape the disease. This shows the share of the population living in slums across Indian metropolitan areas and the spread of the disease. Again, this would have been about in June 2020. The remarkable work of Anup Malani from July 2020 actually measures the prevalence of COVID-19 antibodies as of July of that year. So this is a year and 3 months ago. Anup found that more than 50% of Mumbai's slum dwellers had been exposed to the disease already by July of that year. It just spread so quickly throughout the slums. The good news was the death rates were relatively low because the residents of Mumbai slums are poor. They're thin and they're young, and so they lack the comorbidities which can make COVID-19 so deadly for so many people. Now, of course, it's an airborne disease, whereas a waterborne plague like cholera doesn't spread to far-flung farms that have their own wells. An airborne disease, whether or not it's the influenza pandemic of 1919 or COVID-19, that goes everywhere. And so this did go everywhere. It just entered into cities first. And density was no protection. Density was also no particular correlate of the disease within cities. So this is a map of New York, and I don't know how many of you know New York's geography. These are the 5 boroughs. This slender island here, this is Manhattan. Okay, this is where the tallest towers are. This is Brooklyn, this is Staten Island, this is Queens, and this is the Bronx. And you'll notice that the cases are lowest in the central part of the city, the part that's most built up. The areas that actually got the largest disease are the low density parts of the city, are the areas that are flatter. Now that would seem to be a puzzle, except for the fact that we know that the biggest changes in mobility happened in the central city. This is the first pandemic in history in which we actually see how people moved around during the illness, because we have their cell phone data given to the public by SafeGraph. And so this shows the level of decline of mobility during the early months of the pandemic. And you can see that it was in the urban core that you have the sharpest declines. People on the urban edges were much less likely to reduce their number of trips. Our estimates are that a 10% reduction in trips during this time period is associated with a 20% reduction in the number of illnesses. It wasn't the density of the tall towers that spread the disease. It was how often you left those towers to interact with other people. Now, I want to highlight the difference between the central city and the outlying areas is not because the people in central city were somehow or other more, naturally more healthy or smarter. It was overwhelmingly because they were richer and better educated. And so they worked in industries in which telecommuting was possible. They worked in finance, they worked in consulting, whereas the people in the outer boroughs were more likely to be in those great urban service industries, working in hospitals, in pharmacies, in grocery stores, where they had to come into work because their jobs were all about face-to-face contact. And so they came into work, they continued to have jobs, but they got sick at much higher rates. That in some sense captures the essential vulnerability of the modern economy, which is different than in the past. And it creates this difficult quandary where either the economy is vulnerable or our health is vulnerable. If you go back to the Black Death, right? Go back to the 1350 episode, complete demographic and human catastrophe for Europe. Perhaps a third of Europe's population dies in the Black Death. But it's not an economic catastrophe for the people who survive, because in an economy based on subsistence agriculture, wealth is ultimately determined by the amount of land per capita. And when the population drops by a third, land per capita rises by 50% for those who survive, right? And so, wages went up after the Black Death, in some cases dramatically. This fueled a demand for urban luxury goods, which helped boost the Renaissance that showed up in 15th century Florence or 15th century Bruges. Flash forward to 1918, 1919 to the industrial economy. And we have a great, really high frequency picture of what happened thanks to the work of Francois Veld of the University of the Chicago Federal Reserve Bank. This shows a short, sharp recession due to the pandemic. Mines shut down, even factories sometimes shut down because of the spread of the disease. But they were back up again pretty quickly because there was no reduction in demand for manufactured goods, right? That's also true during our current pandemic. People didn't stop buying cars or washing machines or refrigerators because of the disease. And so the factories were humming again as soon as the immediate onslaught, the first onslaught of the illness was over. By contrast, over the past 100 years, right, automation and outsourcing has meant that those factory jobs have disappeared, and the ability to serve a latte with a smile, or perhaps since this is Australia, a flat white with a smile, has served as an employment safe haven as the factory jobs disappeared. Now, those jobs themselves, those urban service jobs, leisure, hospitality, retail, trade, 32 million Americans in 2019, 1/5 of the total employed labor force, those urban face-to-face service jobs can disappear in a heartbeat when those smiles turn into a source of peril rather than a source of pleasure. And so that's exactly the vulnerability that we're facing, that in fact, our modern urban service economy is incredibly vulnerable to pandemic. Now, looking forward, this attack on our urban world is particularly worrisome because it comes at a time in which many of our cities are very far from united. In the wake of the deindustrialization shock of the 1970s and 1980s, the cities of America and the cities of Europe, and to a lesser extent, even the cities of Australia, had coalesced around a pragmatic consensus, right? That sort of said, we need to provide basic city services, we need to provide safety, and then we will trust the basic economic strength of cities to lift all boats. Over the past 20 years, that pragmatic consensus has unraveled, as increasingly it has been obvious that urban productivity has not lifted up the children of the poor. And I'll show you a little bit of data on this, right? Cities are always places of enormous inequality, and cities should not be ashamed of that. Cities are unequal because they are very pleasant places to be rich, and they are less intolerable places to be poor. They are, places where, the poor can get by without owning a fleet of cars, where they have better access to social services, where they have economic opportunity. But the inequality that is, comprehensive in cities. After all, it was Plato who wrote in the Republic that every city of whatever size is in reality two cities, one a city of the rich, the other a city of the poor, and they are always at war with one another. But that inequality is only bearable if cities are serving their historic function of turning poor children into middle-income adults, and it looks at least that American cities are failing to do that. Secondly, successful cities are becoming permanently unaffordable. This is an American problem, but this is also very much an Australian problem, and for exactly the same reason, which is a failure to build enough affordable housing for ordinary people. In some sense, the corollary of that is that the failure to allow space in our most successful areas have meant that we've created pockets of economic deprivation and despair outside of the most successful areas. And then finally, the rise of unhappiness about the way that we dealt with crime in the 1980s through mass incarceration and brutal police tactics. So just to give you a couple of facts of these things which have left cities more divided and hence more vulnerable. The left-hand side shows the positive connection between GDP per capita and population density across the US. The right-hand side shows the negative correlation between population density and upward mobility. Upward mobility is measured for the cohort that's born between 1978 and 1983. And it asks, if your parent was at the 25th income percentile, meaning 75% of Americans were richer, 25% of Americans were poorer than your parents, where did you end up as an adult in the income distribution? And this shows that, the denser the metropolitan area, the lower you end up doing, the worse you end up doing. This is also true within metropolitan areas. And you can see in the US, there's a really sharp break in upward mobility right at the edge of big city school districts. So this is the underperforming nature of America's city schools. And you can see the sharp decline in the share of the population that's incarcerated at big city school districts. This shows the rise in housing prices in our densest metropolitan areas. You see pretty much all of the price gap is in those expensive areas. This is not just a function of demand. This is a function of a limited amount of supply, which is primarily a question of public policy decisions. Along the horizontal axis here, you show the amount of new building. So this is measured by permits issued between 2000 and 2013, divided by the housing stock in 2000. So that's the amount of supply. Along the vertical axis, the y-axis, is the gulf between the housing prices and the marginal physical cost of production. So in San Francisco, what this dot means is it's 3 times more expensive to buy a house than it is to build a house. Okay. What this means is that the places that build a lot aren't expensive, and the places that are expensive don't build a lot. And there's no repealing the laws of supply and demand. If you have robust demand that is met with anemic supply, places will become too expensive and unaffordable to ordinary people. The downside, another downside of locking people out of our successful cities, is we create these permanent pockets of economic dysfunction and despair. You can see here, overall in the US, we've gone from having 1 in 20 prime age males who were not working when I was born in 1967. For most of the past decade, more than 15% of prime age males in the US have been jobless. But that is not a geographically dispersed fact. Joblessness among prime age males in the US is very geographically concentrated, particularly in the eastern heartland, a swath that starts down in Louisiana and Mississippi, runs up the Appalachia, and ends up in the cities of the Rust Belt. These are less educated places. And in some sense, if you think about the future, right, there's always going to be an entrepreneur in San Francisco or Nashville or New York City who will figure out what a less well-educated person can do in the great urban service economy. But what in the world are they going to do in Alabama? What in the world are they going to do in West Virginia? This shows the rise in the massive number of people that we've locked up in our attempts to deal with our crime problem. So whereas, it's totally understandable that Americans wanted to deal with the crime of their cities, and the declining levels of crime rates are indeed an urban triumph, but it is at best a half urban triumph. It is at best a Pyrrhic urban triumph, because we have only managed to achieve that by locking up millions and millions of people and treating millions and millions of other people to, unacceptably brutal policing tactics. Now, there is then a progressive and understandable progressive desire to try and deal with these, urban inequities. And yet they're running up against the fact that our cities are still deserted, right? How are we going to tax businesses in our cities to pay for this if the cities are still empty? And this shows from Castle data, which is, it's basically high-tech data that measures people coming into their fairly fancy office buildings. So it's not representative. Across the US as a whole, we've gone from having 50 million people working remotely in May of 2020 to having 20 million people working remotely. So 60% of the people who were remote have now come back. But in our fanciest office buildings, in our most successful metropolitan areas, 60% of people went remote and they've stayed remote. And we haven't seen that come back yet. And so that has led people to wonder whether or not electronic technology, whether or not this Zooming will actually make face-to-face contact and the cities that enable that contact obsolete. This is not the first time that question has been asked. In 1980, Alvin, the futurist, wrote in The Third Wave that he anticipated that the high tech of his time would make urban offices obsolete even then. He was living in a great centrifugal age, an age in which cars and radios and television had led to a great dispersal of population from America's formerly dense cities. He was living in an age in which container ships, in which highways that enabled goods to be shipped far more cheaply over space had caused a great deindustrialization of cities like New York, which had contained the largest industrial cluster in the United States in the 1950s. Now, garment production, which had disappeared in a short number of years in the 60s and 70s, never to come back. And so he naturally wondered if these forms of transportation technology for goods had eradicated the goods producing sector of New York, why wouldn't these? The technologies for transmitting ideas in the 1980s, and why wouldn't they kill off urban office work? So he made this prediction that cities like New York would turn into forests of empty skyscrapers. And for 40 years, he was completely and totally wrong, right? I have been grappling with this topic for about 27 years. I think I wrote my first paper on this, where I argued, in fact, that there were good reasons to think that more electronic interactions would then complement face-to-face interactions, that a world in which you have these new technologies which radically increase the returns to being smart, which radically increase the returns to innovation, would lead us to value the cities that enable us to become smart by being around other smart people, right? This is an image of Mike Bloomberg's City Hall, which is copied from his office building, which is copied from the Salomon Brothers trading floor. Trading floors are in some sense the city writ small. They are an industry in which it is, incredibly lucrative to have a little bit more information. And so they're an industry in which they get rid of all the barriers around their workers so they can really sense what's going on in the market. And after all, if new technologies were making, face-to-face contact obsolete, why is it that Google, of all the companies in the world, would prize face-to-face working so much? Why would they buy the Googleplex, buy 1.5 million square feet in downtown Manhattan, right? I think the point is that the more complex the world has become, the easier it is for ideas to get lost in translation. And anyone who's ever taught knows the hard part about teaching is not knowing your subject material. It's knowing whether or not anything you're saying is getting through to your audience. Face-to-face contact makes that possible. Face-to-face contact enables young, entrepreneurial, innovative people to work together in teams to creatively produce new ideas that shift the world. Now, then all of a sudden in 2020, he was right. Right? We all did switch to remote. And for many people, thought it wasn't as bad as they expected. And they appreciated the convenience of being able to work from home. And understand that I am not in any sense suggesting that, hybrid and Zoom isn't going to be part of our future somewhat. But there are real limitations to it that we need to be very clear about. One limitation is that for many jobs, it can enable people to do the same thing they've always done, but it doesn't enable them to learn. It creates static advantages, but it has dynamic costs. One of the best papers that's been written on working from home was written by the Stanford economist Nick Bloom about 7 years ago, using data from a call center in China. This shows a similar experiment that was done in the US with a large online retailer by my former students, Natalia Emanuel and Emma Harrington. What they both studies find the same thing. Go remote, workers become, if anything, slightly more productive, right? Productivity just means how many calls can you bang out? Bang out a lot of calls, the fewer distractions. But both studies find that their workers who are remote are less than 1/2 as likely to be promoted to a upper level call center worker. Now, what does it mean to be an upper center call level worker? It means you get to handle the difficult calls, the real pains in the neck, right? But how would you learn to handle these difficult calls if you were always home? How would your boss learn that you were good at handling them if you were always home? And so in some sense, this is the learning channel shut down. Right? It shows what happens when we lose those rich interactions that come with being face-to-face. Similar fact is true about remote workers, right? So about hiring remote workers. So new workers are the ones who need to learn the most. And there's good evidence to suggest that even though firms kept on their old programmers, their old workers who could go to remote, they stopped hiring new workers. So this comes from work by Jose Ramon Morales Aria and Carlos Daboin, right? This shows on the left-hand side is occupations that had to be done face-to-face. You can see in the first months of the pandemic, both employment in these industries and new postings for this industry, new hires for this industry that collapsed. And then they both came back, right? By contrast, those jobs that could be done remotely, employment stayed flat, new postings collapsed, and they stayed down for over a year, right? So just while Microsoft was telling us that its programmers were just as productive being remote, overall new hires for programmers, new postings for programmers were down by 40% between January of 2020 and December of 2020, right? A massive collapse in new hiring, which goes along with the fact that anyone who teaches knows this is no substitute for inline learning. And we now have scores of studies that show that remote schooling is, pretty darn close to useless. Of course, the other problem with remote work is that it creates monstrous levels of inequality, right? It is a good thing for the skilled people can do it, less skilled people can't do it. At the height of remote work, 68.9% of Americans with advanced degrees were working remotely. 5% of Americans with high school dropouts were working remotely. 15% of Americans who had a high school degree and no more were working remotely. If your future is virtual, that is a future that is even more awfully unequal than the future that we had in 2019. I think looking forward, everything depends upon the medical response. If the shock doesn't end quickly, if we get new pandemics in the future, then the costs for cities and all the economy are enormous. If we muddle through this thing in 2022, right, and we don't have another pandemic, if we invest what we need to make sure that it doesn't happen again, then there will be real costs, but it's not going to change urban life massively. So there are going to be short-term consequences. Commercial space will be more vulnerable than residential space. Tourism will be substantially down. Business travel will be down more than normal tourism. Cities will reallocate from the old to the young. Businesses will reallocate from the old to the young in cities. Global talent has just gotten more mobile. And yet there is this urge to help the urban disadvantaged, right? Which if we try to just do that by taxing businesses, by taxing the rich, they will just move as they did in the 1970s. And so we need to have smarter government rather than just more or less government. We need to have fewer regulations that bind small businesses or bind builders. And we need to constantly experiment and evaluate. I'm just going to point out here that the impact of a pandemic on a reduction in demand for office space, which I believe will happen, from the rise of hybrid work, that will show up primarily in expensive markets, including Sydney, in terms of lower prices, not in terms of vacancies. Right? Because even if in a place like New York or San Francisco, prices drop by 20%, those prices are still plenty high enough for people to still occupy them. By contrast, in places like Grand Rapids or Detroit or Columbus, right, you could have a really substantial drop in prices that could actually lead to vacancies. And then those vacancies could spill over throughout the overall economy. Now, I think Zoom means, and I just want to sort of end on this, the competition for global talent has just gotten hotter. We've been spared seeing what that does because of the barriers to mobility during the pandemic, but it will happen. And so Sydney faces a question. Sydney is a great consumer city. It's a city of remarkable beauty. It's a city with fantastic climate, right? How can it compete in this world? So I think the things that seem most obvious to me is to continue focusing on ground up entrepreneurship, right? To make sure that it is as easy as possible to start a new business in Sydney. Right now, the experience economy is far more important for cities than the goods economy. So particularly focus on the entrepreneurs of experience, and better yet, if they are lower income entrepreneurs of experience, because that's where you get upward mobility out of this. You want to think about building for flexible uses. It's unclear, right, how much future there is in urban retail. So we want to make sure that we're building in ways that allow for conversions, even conversions between office and residential. In Boston, the crazy thing is there's such a boom in lab space. People are trying to convert Class C commercial space into laboratory space. Think about congestion pricing, as in London, right? It's the best way we have for dealing with traffic congestion. When possible, pay for new transportation with really high density real estate development. The most beautiful model is the cross-subsidization with the Hong Kong MTR of railroad with high rises that get built right over railroad stops, and so are perfectly integrated. And finally, I will just end with this, right? This is not a question for Sydney or for Boston or for London. It's a question for our countries and for multiple countries together. We need something that is much more robust than the WHO to fight future pandemics. We need really a NATO for health. And that means we need to have more spending, more coordination, and I think a global trade where money flows from the wealthy world to cities of the developing world to help pay for sewers, to help pay for public health interventions. And in exchange, the cities of the poor world are going to agree to have better monitoring systems and to have engage in better rules. I will just end by noting cities are amazingly resilient. They've been through worse than this and come out soaring. And I have every faith that cities will continue to be resilient in the future. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Glaeser. And it is it's a very readable book. I finished it last night. So yeah, easy to get, ordered to Australia. All right. The end of cities has been predicted over and over. And you have this wonderful discussion of the futurists, Toffler in the 1970 predicting that the telephone, the telegraph, the automobile, all enabling people to live farther away, and it didn't happen. And yet, all over Europe and the United States, between 1950 and 1980, the great cities lost population. It didn't end the city as a human artifact, but it was a rough time for cities. It did happen. The person who's really made the case for that in the US is probably Noah Smith, who's argued earlier this year that it's not COVID that is gonna spur decentralization, it's the internet. And essentially that what we're experiencing right now is a delayed working out of the internet as it and its implications for working and living. Do you think there is any chance that over time, in the longer run, we see this second and third order effects?
I think it's impossible to perfectly predict the future, but for the last 25 years, I've been saying that the technological changes that we see around us are actually making the case for cities stronger, not weaker. And at least until 2019, I was having a pretty good track record. So I'm tending to stick with that. I think the key is that, and there are lots of things going on here. So one aspect of this is this, thing that the technologies are complementing skill. The technologies are complementing innovation. The technologies are making it possible to source it on every side of the planet, to build it on every side of the planet, right? Our comparative advantage is our creativity as human beings relative to machines, and that comes from human contact. And I don't think that's going to go away. Secondly, if you think about the future of less skilled labor, right? Building things, making things, except if they're very sort of boutique, handmade things, that's all going to be done by machines, right? That's going to be done by machines in low density places. And, that's not a viable future. And so unless you're imagining an incredibly dystopian future with just, massive numbers of unemployed people, you've got to be thinking about a world of cities, both for people at the high end of the human capital distribution who learn from each other in cities and create more, and people at the lower end of the human capital distribution who are engaged in the creative process of coming up with this urban service economy, which is in itself, just as creative as the high end. So I just have very little belief that, a couple of decades of technology are going to overrule millions of years of evolution that have just made us into a very, very social species.
Your history of the plagues in Rome, I think the moral of that is it depends on the pre-existing health or strength of the society when the stress hits or the shock hits. Applying that analogy to, well, I guess the same thing is true of deindustrialization in the 1970s. Cities recovered, but not all cities. Are there any cities you would be worried about today in terms of the impacts of this shock of COVID?
Oh, for sure. Absolutely. I think people will eventually come back to the office markets in Sydney and New York and San Francisco. I think that the cities that really haven't recovered from the deindustrialization shock, this is not good for them. And the idea that somehow or other the low-cost cities, the Rust Belt, are going to come back because they have cheap space, that's just that just misses the essence of just how much space there is in America and how much cheap real estate there is in America. So I fear that this will again be quite rough for the relatively cold, deindustrialized cities of the Midwest. So those are places I fear for most. And the winners are those places that are likely to, offer high levels of amenities for highly mobile, highly skilled workers. So there are people who will be leaving New York and San Francisco. I don't think the right model is the tech firm is going to say, oh, we're just going to all dial it in. We're just going to all go to our suburban homes. They want to be together. They want to connect with each other. But, they may decide, why don't we go to Vail? We all love skiing. Why do we go to Honolulu? We all love surfing. Why don't we go to Austin, Texas? We all love not paying income taxes, right? And any one of those things are possible. And so that's going to put more competitive pressure on San Francisco. And it's going to mean that those cities that are able to compete along different dimensions will in fact do well out of this.
It's a risk to try to write a book in a hurry like this about in response to something happening in real time. Has anything changed in either the facts or in your thinking since you had to turn in the final draft?
Well, facts, look, we turned in the final draft in December 31st, 2020. So this book was out in 2020, and everything since then has essentially been editing on this. I think I expected the pandemic to be over faster than it was. I certainly, did I call the Delta variant? Absolutely not. I had no. So in some sense, it has been worse than we thought it would be. I probably expected, because I expected us to be through the Delta variant faster, I would have expected office markets in New York to be coming back more quickly than they currently have. So that's something that I certainly got wrong. I expected the economic fallout to last for longer, because I didn't anticipate the huge level of public response. So I guess that was foolish of me. I should have already seen, because I was aware of the Paycheck Protection Program, which was federal largesse on an enormous scale. And that is in some sense, hidden, and different countries did it in different ways. But this was something which no government no wealthy government decided to sit by the sidelines on this. They let the sluice gates flow of cash. And that meant in some sense that none of us have seen the full economic damage of this yet. And so that was something that I couldn't predict either. And the rest of it, it's not so much that I think I got it all right. It's just the uncertainty hasn't been resolved yet. So I think I may well get many things substantially wrong, but we're still, unfortunately, in the teeth of this thing. After all, you just had your Freedom Day yesterday. Yeah.
A couple of questions have come in about global labor markets. This experience of going through COVID has revealed some good things and some bad things about the United States, and same with Australia. Do you think there's going to be any long-term change in the sort of desirability of global labor flows or global capital investment based on a different understanding of which places are capable of handling stress or a shock like this?
Oh, I think you've got to, you've got to think this is a big deal, right? And there are some countries that did a lot better than others at handling this. And I hope there are, the good thing about this is I hope that the countries that underperformed, and I certainly count my own country as being a big underperformer, respond to this by recognizing that we just left ourselves being too vulnerable. I mean, that's part of, one part of that is why there are, 4 chapters about health in the book is we thought that it's sort of amazing that America's healthcare system could spend so many trillions of dollars on allegedly protecting illness and end up with this kind of an outcome. Whereas, East Asian countries, Australia, as you say, during the early going, New Zealand, throughout most of the going, right, did particularly well. And that's something that I think global markets should pay some attention to, certainly.
It's been, Australia forgot to purchase vaccines in the middle there. But other than that, it's a country that trusts government much more than the United States, and where it's much less polarized for a lot of institutional reasons. And certainly we think there's a story to tell that makes places like Sydney and Melbourne really attractive for the mobile global talent. So I guess, it'll be interesting to see if that matters.
I don't think it's a story that you have to tell. I think it's just a fact that Sydney and Melbourne are highly attractive cities to global talent. I think by any objective measure, they are incredibly attractive places.
One of the signals that showed up in Australia as well as the United States is a huge escalation in rents in resort communities during the last couple of years. So ski towns like in Tahoe, beach towns like Byron Bay here. Do you see that as a long-term shift in a demand profile of where people with means want to be, or is that just something temporary during the pandemic?
Well, I think the level of price increases is hardly likely to be a long-term steady state outcome. I mean, this was crisis buying to get away someplace pleasant by people with a lot of resources and a desire to be isolated. But the Zoom has made them more mobile, and I think there'll be a demand for highly pleasant places. I mean, I don't think the young and the hungry are likely to go to a resort town and just decide to dial it in from there. But do I think that, there are plenty of 50-somethings who might decide, I can still handle my portfolio or deal with my venture capital issues from a remote issue. And maybe I'm 30% less productive, but, this is still good. And I like being there. Yes, I think that's entirely possible. Of course, what that does to prices is all going to depend upon how restricted the housing supply is of that in that area, how difficult it is to build. But those are the types of places I would expect to be long-term winners from this. The interesting thing is for some high vacation places, you had two forces battling it out, one of which is the collapse in global travel, right, which then had to battle against people moving out there because they were, hiding out in the Canaries or hiding out in Jackson Hole, Wyoming.
A question about remote work. Do we have evidence about the differential impacts of remote work in terms of gender inequality? There are kind of two opposing arguments that are being put forward. One is it allows working moms to stay in the game and stay full-time employed because of the flexibility rather than drop out of the labor force. The other argument is that they're going to absent themselves from the deep learning and networking of actually going into the office, and that will show up in less likely to be promoted as partner down the road. Do we know anything about? Is there evidence about which of these is likely to be true?
Well, I think both of them are likely to be true. I mean, certainly we know from pre-pandemic, the work of my colleague, Mandy Pallas and many others, but a huge demand for flexibility in work, particularly for moms. And that's likely to continue. But, the work that I just showed from then, this is just call centers. This is hardly like the highest of all human capital occupations. The promotion impacts of going remote are real. So it's presumably it's better to have that option, but it's not a free lunch. And so I would expect that there will be parents who continue to do this, who appreciate this, but it's something that they will bear a cost for, that you suggest. And I don't think there's any escaping that.
A question on inequality. Other than decontrolling the supply in the expensive markets, what are your views on the most important levers that would reduce inequality in cities?
Well, I think it's, for me, beyond the housing side, which is one side, and it's a side where I believe that you can actually promote affordable housing without spending a single penny of government dollars. That's, I think, one of the reasons why that's attractive. And I don't think there are other ones that fit that follow that side. I think it's mostly about education. And it is you can do more with early childhood education, which we've known for 50 years can be an effective lever. But, in the book, we push strongly for doing more around experimentation in education that wraps around traditional schooling, vocational training people to be plumbers or to be computer programmers, after school, on the weekends, over the summer. And the beauty of this kind of thing is it can take advantage of the natural competitiveness of cities. It can take advantage of the fact that cities have, for-profit companies that might want to provide this. They have trade unions that might want to provide this. They have community colleges or the equivalent outside the US that might want to provide this. And so you can have a sort of competitive market. And the reason why you can really have competition for this in a way that's not as easy with traditional schooling is you actually know exactly what you want to teach. So whereas we can't exactly agree on whether or not you've managed to deliver a perfectly formed 19-year-old high school graduate, like we know what plumbing is like, and we know what it means to train a skilled plumber. And so you can really have pay for performance. And so that reduces the fact that a for-profit company is just going to be able to figure out how to rip off the public by delivering a substandard product, because they're only going to get paid if they actually train people who actually know how to do the skill.
Okay, yeah. So education, increasing the ability to earn a wage in the market would be the other side of driving down housing costs. The book talks about centripetal versus centrifugal forces and the argument seems to be at any one time both are operating. Do you see any? What do you see as the primary forces operating right now, and how has that changed?
Well, so there's no question that the dominant fact during the mid-20th century was all about the centrifugal forces, the forces pushing people away from cities. And this is the car and the television and so forth. The 19th century was a centripetal age, right? Where we had, the steam engine and the skyscraper and the streetcar, all of which contributed to bring people closer together in urban cores. the surprise was that, Toffler and others thought that, as I guess Noah Smith does, that, information technology would be yet another centrifugal force. The interesting thing is that for most of the past 40 years, it wasn't. And I think going forward, it still won't be. But there's no question that Zoom is, mildly a centrifugal object, right? It is a force enabling us to work at longer distances. And it's not that I don't think that exists. It's that I continue to think that the increasingly, social nature of human work, and you see this really in the work of Dave Deming at the Harvard Kennedy School, who has shown over the past 15 years that whereas the 1980s and early 1990s were just the age of the quant, where the ability to sort of, process mathematical things which was where you really saw rising wages, the past 15 to 20 years has been the age of the socialized quant. It was not just about, your ability to do stuff alone in your room. It was your ability to talk at the same time. It was your ability to be a connector of different worlds. And that I think is likely to continue, that, we don't have a comparative advantage of doing things in isolation, and that's been true for thousands of years. But most of the things we can do in isolation, you can do with a computer or with a machine. It's really the things that we do together that actually give us value. And so I really think that this technological change, when it clears the air, is going to leave space primarily for people to come together and to learn from one another, to be with one another. The other thing, of course, that is also important is, and certainly all of us who have been through lockdown, you've got to feel this in your bones, right? That in fact, we were meant to be with other people, even if it had nothing to do with productivity. It's just more fun. Life is better lived live. And I can just tell you, I've been back in the office since August 16th. And I can tell you there's just no difference in the way that our graduate students and our undergraduates experience life right now relative to the last year. I mean, they're just so much happier, even though it's all behind masks, even though they have to put up with 3 times of testing a week, just to be with other people is just a tremendous source of joy. And that ultimately is the guarantor of success, at least for, our more fortunate cities.
Okay, so we could go all day, but we must bring this to a close. For a final question, if you could wake up 10 years from now and look at the state of urban America and feel like progress had been made on the big issues, what would it look like? What would you hope you could see?
A thriving set of programs that provide skills for the children of the most disadvantaged. A case in which cities have actually turned themselves from being, agents of insiders to agents for empowering outsiders. Cities that actually make entrepreneurship as easy as possible. And I'm not against sensible regulations, right? I mean, the way that we got clean cities in the 19th century was by having regulations that told tenement owners they had to connect to the water system, right? You need some regulations, but they need to be assessed using proper cost-benefit analysis. And so, and ideally, they need to be made as user-friendly as possible. We would have taller skylines in many areas, but we also would have preserved a rich fabric in those cities that actually have history. And so cities would retain a character, even though in some pockets they make space to build up. We would have a network of global, pandemic spotters, and we would have a well-developed, industry that was about preparing us to make sure we face the next pandemic, to make sure that doesn't happen. Cities would continue to be archipelagos of neighborhoods. And I think for me, I'm always a pedestrian. So I always like seeing more space where people can walk in cities. But I recognize that there needs to be heterogeneity and there need to be different forms. But I do share the view of almost all, of a wide majority of urbanists that sort of, I like to see a few less cars and a few more people walking around, hopefully in beautiful city streets with plenty of greenery in them, right? I mean, plenty of green space. And what part of the beauty of building up is you don't have to seize space from parks, and you don't have to seize land that goes out, that could be otherwise used for greenery. Finally, of course, cities will have done more to protect themselves against the possible downsides of global warming. And that's, remember the other disaster that we haven't talked about. I don't talk about it in this book, although I did talk about it in my last book. I figured one disaster, one of the horsemen of the apocalypse was enough for one book, but it's still there. And I think above all, there would be places that, once again, are places where people find joy by being around other people, where we revel in the company and in the creativity of others, and especially where, the young can have the same sort of excitement that I did when I was a teenager in Manhattan in the early 1980s. And they will be able to have that fun and enjoy the possibility, even if their parents were poor immigrants or were the children of the poor. So cities that are places of possibility for everyone.
Wow. I think that is a vision we can sign up to here in Sydney as well. Thank you very much, Professor Glaeser, for taking time with us. And everybody, thank you for joining. We'll see you at the next one.
Thank you.